Germany had surrendered. The camps had been liberated. And yet, in the summer of 1945, SS officers, men who had run the machinery of mass murder, were standing in front of Patton's command, requesting something that defied every moral logic of the war just one. They wanted protection. Not from Allied prosecutors. Not from war crimes tribunals. They wanted protection from the prisoners they had tortured, starved and broken for years. Men who were still alive. Men who now knew where their guards slept. Patton had fought across North Africa, Sicily, and the length of Western Europe to reach this moment. And this was the moment victory delivered to him. What did Patton say when the men who built the camps asked him to keep their victims away? By the late spring and early summer of 1945, the Third Reich had ceased to exist in any organised military sense. The Wehrmacht had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The administrative architecture of the Nazi state had collapsed into rubble and ash. But what had not collapsed, not yet, not cleanly, was the human aftermath. George S. Patton commanded the Third Army, and in the occupation that followed the fighting, held authority over enormous stretches of Bavaria and the surrounding regions. These were not empty territories. They were filled with the wreckage of a continent, displaced persons by the millions, former concentration camp prisoners who had survived on almost nothing, and, critically, former SS personnel who had not yet been formally processed, imprisoned, or handed to war crimes investigators. The end of the shooting war had not produced clarity. It had produced chaos in a uniform. Patton was a man who understood movement, momentum, and decisive action. The occupation environment gave him none of those things. It gave him competing pressures from Washington, from Eisenhower's headquarters, from Allied policy architects who were already beginning to calculate a post-war world rather than fully reckon with the war just ended. Into this environment came a problem that was not military in the traditional sense. It was moral, political, and deeply human. The SS guards who had operated the concentration camps in his zone of occupation were frightened. The survivors who had endured those camps were filled with a rage that required no explanation and no justification. And Patton, a man who had never been known for patience with complexity, was being asked to stand between them. The request, when it came, carried a particular kind of arrogance that only total moral collapse could produce. Former SS officers and camp personnel, finding themselves in Patton's occupation zone, sought the protection of the very army that had defeated them. They did not want to face the prisoners they had commanded, humiliated, and in countless cases condemned to death. They were afraid. And they wanted American soldiers to serve as the barrier between themselves and that fear. This was not an abstract policy question. The surviving prisoners, Jews, political prisoners, forced labourers, prisoners of war from across occupied Europe, had been gathered into what the occupation forces were calling displaced persons camps, or DP camps. The conditions in some of these camps were, by most historical accounts, poor. The survivors were often still malnourished, still traumatised, still without a country to return to, without families they knew were alive, without anything that resembled a future. They were technically free. In practice, they were warehoused. Meanwhile, the very men responsible for their suffering were in some cases being held in the same geographic areas, or were navigating the post-war confusion with far greater confidence than their victims. Some had shed their SS insignia. Some had acquired forged papers. Some were simply waiting for the administrative chaos to protect them the way no law would. The contradiction was stark, and to any honest observer, infuriating. The men who had commanded murder were asking for safety. The men who had survived murder were being kept behind wire. Patton was not a man given to abstract moral theorising, but he was a man who understood power, and he understood insult. The request from SS personnel for American protection was both. What made the problem more than a simple matter of military administration was the political dimension building behind it. The question of what to do with former SS personnel, former Nazi officials, and former concentration camp operators was not being decided by generals alone. Washington had opinions. Allied command had opinions. And those opinions were already beginning to be shaped by something beyond justice, by the emerging calculation of what a stable, reconstructed Germany might look like in a world that was rapidly reorganizing itself around a new confrontation with the Soviet Union. The practical reality on the ground in 1945 Bavaria was something that no victory parade could fully address. Patton's zone contained an enormous population of people who had been destroyed by the Nazi system and were now dependent on an occupying army that was simultaneously trying to administer a defeated nation. The DP camps that held survivors of the concentration camps were, by multiple historical accounts, inadequately supplied and poorly organised in the early months of occupation. A report submitted by Earl Harrison, a representative sent by President Truman to assess conditions, described some of the camps in terms that drew direct and uncomfortable comparisons to the facilities run by the regime that had just been defeated. Harrison's report reached Truman in the summer of 1945 and caused significant concern at the highest levels of American government. Patton was at the centre of this, and his response to the situation, both to the conditions in the DP camps and to the question of former SS personnel, revealed the contradictions of the man and the moment. On one hand, Patton was outraged by the requests of SS officers seeking protection. His known command style, his documented contempt for moral cowardice, his visceral contempt for men who inflicted suffering on the defenceless, all of this made the idea of SS guards hiding behind American soldiers a kind of provocation he was not built to absorb quietly. The exact words Patton used in response to such requests are not preserved with certainty in the surviving record, but the historical context makes the reaction understandable. Patton did not accommodate weakness in his own officers. The idea of extending protection to men who had built their careers on the systematic brutalization of unarmed civilians would have struck him as a grotesque inversion of everything a soldier was supposed to stand for. But the situation did not resolve itself into a clean moral confrontation, because the same period also saw Patton make decisions about the administration of his zone that were controversial in the opposite direction. His handling of former Nazi officials, retaining some in administrative positions because he viewed them as the most capable local administrators available, drew fierce criticism and ultimately contributed to his removal from command of the Third Army. Patton's approach to the post-war occupation was a tangle of genuine outrage at Nazi crimes and pragmatic, sometimes deeply misguided, assessments of what occupation governance required. This is what made the SS protection request so revealing. It did not arrive in a simple moral landscape. It arrived in a zone where the lines between victimizer and administrator, between defeated enemy and necessary bureaucrat, were already being blurred by the demands of occupation politics. The survivors in the DP camps understood this. They had survived the camps by learning to read the small signals of power, to detect when protection was genuine and when it was performance. Some attempted to reach former guards on their own terms. Some organised within the camps. Some appealed to Jewish welfare organisations, to military chaplains, to any authority that would listen. Their situation, still confined, still dependent, still without resolution, was becoming evidence that something in the promise of liberation had not been fully kept. The silence around that evidence was accumulating, and the silence had a shape. The confrontation between what the SS had been and what they were now asking for was not a single dramatic scene. History rarely works in scenes. It works in accumulating pressure, in the weight of decisions made and unmade, in the gap between what a moment demands and what men in power choose to deliver. What is historically clear is that Patton occupied a position where he was being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. There were survivors who needed advocacy. There were SS personnel who needed accountability. There were occupation administrators who needed to rebuild a functioning civil society from the ruins of a genocidal state. And there was Washington, already looking past the rubble at the Soviet threat to the east, already asking whether Germany's former professionals, including some of its most organised and administratively capable former officials, might be more valuable as partners in a new confrontation than as defendants in old tribunals. Patton found this political calculation corrosive. The accounts of his private communications and conversations from this period indicate a man who was increasingly convinced that the post-war settlement was being shaped by forces that had less to do with the truth of what had happened in Europe and more to do with strategic positioning for what was coming next. He was not wrong about the positioning. He was not always right about his conclusions. But the direction of his frustration was real. The answer to what Patton said when SS officers asked for protection is not found in a single preserved exchange. The historical record does not give us that moment in a court reporter's transcript. What it gives us is context, pattern, and outcome. Patton was not a man who offered comfort to men he considered cowards or criminals. His contempt for those who inflicted suffering on the powerless was documented across multiple theatres of the war. The idea that he extended warmth or sympathy to former camp personnel seeking shelter behind American soldiers is not supported by anything in the historical character of the man. What is also clear is that the situation could not be resolved by one general's contempt, however genuine. The SS officers existed inside a legal and administrative system that was still being constructed. War crimes proceedings were underway, but they were selective. The machinery of accountability was real, but it was slow, and it was surrounded by the same political calculations that were reshaping everything else in post-war Europe. Patton did not wait well, that much is certain. The men were still missing answers, the survivors were still waiting, the guards were still calculating, and the war had ended on paper. Not for the people living inside that gap. The consequences of this period extended far beyond Patton's personal frustrations and far beyond the specific question of SS guards and their demands. What happened in the DP camps of occupied Germany in 1945 and 1946 became one of the founding moral failures of the post-war settlement, not because no one cared, but because caring was consistently subordinated to convenience. The Harrison Report, when it reached Truman, resulted in direct pressure on Eisenhower and on occupation authorities to improve conditions for displaced persons. Change came, but slowly. The survivors in the camps waited months and, in some cases, years for resettlement or repatriation. Many had nowhere to return to. Their homes had been destroyed, their families had been murdered, their communities had been erased. Liberation had been real. But liberation into limbo was its own kind of sentence. Patton's role in this aftermath was complicated and ultimately self-destructive. His public comments on denazification, suggesting that the distinction between former Nazis and other political parties was not meaningfully different from American partisan politics, resulted in his relief from command of the Third Army in October 1945. He was reassigned to a largely ceremonial position. He died in December 1945 following a vehicle accident, never having returned to combat, never having fully reconciled the war he had fought with the peace that followed it. The former SS personnel who had sought protection in the confusion of occupation received a range of outcomes. Some were prosecuted, some were not. Some disappeared into the administrative complexity of a continent being rebuilt from almost nothing. The systems designed to ensure accountability were real but imperfect, and the political pressures of the emerging Cold War ensured that imperfection was often convenient rather than incidental. The survivors who had asked for justice received some of it. Not enough of it. Never enough of it. Their voices in the immediate post-war period were often the least powerful in the room. That imbalance was its own kind of verdict on what victory had actually delivered. What Patton's experience in the occupation reveals is something more disturbing than any battlefield defeat could have produced. A man who had fought across 2 continents to destroy a system of organised evil found himself, at the moment of that system's collapse, facing a world that was already moving on. Not because the evil was forgiven, not because the suffering was forgotten, but because the next calculation had already begun. And the next calculation had different requirements. The men who had run the camps were afraid of their victims. That fear was, in its way, a form of recognition. They knew what they had done. They knew the scale of it, and they understood, in the confusion of 1945, that the army standing between them and the consequences of their choices might be persuaded to hold that position if the political logic supported it. The survivors understood something different. They understood that victory, announced from capitals and celebrated in streets, had not reached them yet. That liberation was a word before it was a fact. That the men responsible for their suffering were in the same geographic space, navigating the same administrative chaos, and waiting for the same political calculations to run in their favour. Patton stood in the middle of this and did not have the tools to resolve it. His tanks were useless here. His aggressive forward momentum had no application. The enemy was no longer a column of armour on a road. The enemy was delay, silence, bureaucratic friction, and the willingness of powerful men to treat justice as a variable rather than a constant. The last enemy of a war is never the soldier still holding a rifle. It is the official who decides that accounting for the dead is less important than managing the living. It is the system that protects the powerful by exhausting the powerless. It is the silence that follows victory and calls itself peace. Patton knew silence was not peace. He had just never expected to find it on his own side.